the Olympia, a portrait of a female courtesan this time, exhibiting herself with precisely the same mixture of arrogance and irony. But that is purely a coincidence. Manet could never have seen this Bacchus. It wasn't discovered in the basement of the Uffizi until 1916. The 1590s, most mannerism in Rome had degenerated into this kind of high-flown ornament, an assembly of decorative stereotypes. Its peculiar artificialities were already coming under attack from younger artists, and Caravaggio presently became their accepted leader, because he was interested in what seemed to be plain speech rather than rhetoric. He painted from life, from models, and made a point of it. It was here, Piazza Navona, that Caravaggio would hang out and find his models. Now, in ancient Roman times, this square used to be the circus of Diocletian, but even in Caravaggio's day, I imagine it could not have looked very much like this. There was no Church of Sant'Agnese there. That obelisk did not exist. Bernini's Fountain of the Four Rivers had not yet been conceived. The whole place was dusty and ill-paved and packed, but it was an amazing theatre of human action, and in that respect, it has not changed. Piazza Navona was one of the hubs of Rome, both for the rich and for those who lived off the flank of the rich. The whores and the hustlers, the gypsies, as well as the cardinals, and the odd English tourist, and even the occasional Spanish diplomat. The stock of types and costumes and gestures that Caravaggio was to accumulate in such places as this was going to nourish his art for the rest of his life. And on the street, he found a vitality that could not be matched by any pattern book.
He called a gypsy woman that happened to be passing in the street and took her to his lodging, where he drew her in the act of telling the future, as these women of the Egyptian race are accustomed to do.
These scenes of Caravaggio's, with their gypsies and card sharps and suckers being fleeced, would soon be imitated throughout Europe, and they became a standard kind of picturesque genre. But his pictures also look back to the 15th century, and especially to Giorgione. Not just in the shadowed faces and the sense of intimate colloquy, or in the subtle theatre of expression, but in costume too.
As a matter of fact, by the 1590s, the fashion for bright colours and gaudy display had completely gone out of Rome, and a kind of fanatical Spanish sobriety, all black, had taken its place. And so, like the hippies and the freaks of the 60s who used to preen themselves here on Piazza Navona in their Moroccan plumage and their Edwardian tat, Caravaggio's street models wore a kind of defiant historical fancy dress, almost a century old, suggesting perhaps a wistful desire for romantic flash amid the bureaucratic austerities of the Counter-Reformation.
Up to now, Caravaggio had only done a few religious paintings. This was the first and the most primitive, St. Francis in Ecstasy, painted around 1592. Night beside a river. The moon leaves a few streaks on the water, but otherwise the landscape is unintelligible, a black wedge. St. Francis has had his vision of God. It's overwhelmed him, and he swoons into the arms of an angel who bends over him like a lover. The angel is the usual early Caravaggio boy, half naked, the shoulder gleaming in the dark. The finger of his right hand is hooked under the saint's girdle, and the whole image is suffused with eroticism. But then the likeness of spiritual and sexual ecstasy was one of the big themes in religious art and poetry in the 17th century. The other early religious pictures look rather less devout. This is St. Catherine of Alexandria, and it's a more sophisticated composition, and Caravaggio must have had some enjoyment from painting the elegant lines of the palm frond and the sword, and also the sadism of his later work is beginning to announce itself in the contrast between those steel tusks on the wheel and the girl's soft shoulder, and in the reflection of that red cushion on the sword tip, like blood. But this is not a sacred picture. It's a portrait of a handsome woman in saint's costume, and this secular realist bias wasn't lost on his audience.
He depicted a girl seated on a chair, her hands in her lap, in the act of drying her hair. He painted her in a room, and by adding on the ground a small jar of ointment with trinkets and jewels, he would have us believe that she was the Magdalene.
Thus Bellori described Caravaggio's Magdalene. And it did look secular, being so terse. The body language of penitence comes down to a slump of the shoulders and one tear on the side of the nose. A Roman girl in her Sunday best, sitting in a dingy bare room with a tiled floor. But there's a triangle of light up there on the wall, and that patch is a premonition. It reads as nature, sunlight from a hidden window. But it's also meant to suggest the grace of repentance creeping into Mary's soul, and this way of using realist effects for symbolic ends would become quite central in Caravaggio's work because it eased the conflict between allegory and realism. He wanted to be credible. He wanted to locate the miraculous in the matrix of everyday life, which is where it first happened in the Bible. And the first picture in which he brought that off was the supper at Emmaus. The risen Christ reveals himself to his disciples while breaking bread in an inn, and St. James's arms spring out in amazement, in a mimicry of crucifixion, by the way. Another disciple is halfway out of his chair with shock, and the innkeeper has no idea of what's going on. Nor do we at first, because the bread, which you'd expect to be the focus of the picture, is half hidden behind that chicken and eclipsed by Caravaggio's favourite fruit basket perched there on the edge of the table. It's a curious combination of religious drama with the casualness of everyday life, and one wonders what the Roman connoisseurs made of that frayed apostolic elbow with a hole in it, shoved in their eyes. Well, the answer is that they didn't like it at all, because such things offended their sense of decorum. Later, Bellori would even complain that Caravaggio's realism was out of kilter, because, as he pointed out, the meeting at Emmaus took place after the resurrection, in the spring, and the fruit in that basket are autumn fruit. But decorum was essentially abstract. It involved, first of all, a high level of style. It meant continuous modelling, such as you got in Raphael, the obedient light passing over a shape and not calling too much attention to itself. And in narrative painting, it also called for a dignified and steady unfolding of stories, a consistent fictional tone without sudden flashes and grand dramatic climaxes. Caravaggio now set himself to break every single one of these rules. He painted a Medusa for the Cardinal del Monte, and to make it look more real, Caravaggio painted it on a convex boss of wood covered in canvas to simulate the round shield in which Perseus saw the reflection of Medusa's head. He painted the sacrifice of Isaac, and to show a knife like that, you must know how to use one. Abraham holds his son the way a fisherman grips a big fish just back of the gills while gutting it, and only a connoisseur of violence would show you that thick, implacable thumb forcing Isaac's head down on the altar, and that squalling mouth. But the most extreme image from this time was Caravaggio's Judith and Holofernes, which he painted in the late 1590s. It's guignol of the most specific sort. The story of the young Jewish heroine killing the foreign tyrant had been done by many another artist before, but never with this macabre intensity. Blood, darkness. Blood streaming from Holofernes' neck, darkness washing over his muscles, holding the figures motionless in the middle of violent action. A real tableau. Another artist might have made Judith lean forward and deprived her stiff pose of that peculiarly truthful mixture of resolve and loathing. But Caravaggio knew how awkward it is to handle a heavy sword like that, and so Judith is sawing inexpertly through the tendons with a compressed look of disgust, watched by that eager crone of a nurse. One of the commonest themes of killing in Christian art was David and Goliath, and Caravaggio often returned to it. About death, he was very seldom wrong. It obsessed him, but he didn't invest it with glamour, because he so obviously knew what it looked like. This is probably the least gung-ho David in Italian art, and he's manifestly put off by the gross, dripping trophy in his hand.